There's one issue of history which we know with certainty, and even in history things are often difficult to determine as absolute fact. But we know from numerous eyewitness testimonies that this entire terrace was utilised as the last redoubt of the headquarters element of the Rising of 1916, and that is simply a fact. Most of the back gardens were also utilised. There were outposts in this sector, and severe fighting north inner city on both sides of O'Connell Street and back indeed towards the River Liffey itself. These are historical facts, they're certainties. And any attempt to temporise that, to wish it away, to airbrush it out of the situation, is nothing short of fiction. So if we're the type of country that would accept us telling us lies about our past, well then it's something we can come to terms with. But we never have been. This country has experienced generation after generation of adversity due to our experience of imperialism from our nearest neighbour. And that is not simply rhetorical. The fact that the matter is, when Óglaigh na hÉireann was founded in November 1913, and the same month that the Irish Citizen Army began to interact with other older groups and newer, collaborations, there was no such thing as national government. Now, Wolfe Tone had been saying that in the 1790s. The original rebels as such of the Republic Continuum are the United Irishmen of 1791, who rose in 1798 and again in 1803, who had a biological link to men like Holmes, brother-in-law of Robert Emmet, into Young Ireland in 1848, whose survivors went on to found the Irish Republican Brotherhood and the Fenian Brotherhood in 1858. They recoalesced in the United States at Clan Gael and had their greatest moment of success here, in this very sector of Dublin City and in these buildings in Easter 1916. Now that is a long time to seek national government and sovereignty, self-determination and democracy. It has recently been suggested that those who fought in 1916 had no mandate and in fact were interfering with the correct governance of these islands and this country. That of course is utter nonsense. How can you describe a self-described government, how can you accord them the status of governance and parliamentarianism when half the population were not allowed to vote and most of the other half could not vote either? Any electorate that is comprised of some men is not a democracy. You add to that fact that due to their selfish internal reasons, they imposed on us a sectarian monarchy, which was not just anathema to the vast majority of people professing nominally the faith of the Catholic Church, but also to non-conformist Protestants. Anyone who was not effectively a landed member of the Anglican elite, you're not looking at a situation that would be tenable in a modern democratic disposition. They had no written constitution, they had no Bill of Rights, they had no separate judiciary. The highest court of appeal was the House of Lords in the so-called Palace of Westminster in London. These are not the hallmarks of governance. It is true to say that those who fought in 1916 regard themselves as rebels. Now, with our current politically correct environment, phrases like rebels can be misinterpreted or perhaps taken out of context. The men of 1917-98 and the men and women of 1916 were rebels. There's no doubt about that. But they were not rebelling against lawful authority because there was none in Ireland. The Home Rule Bill eventually and disgracefully eked through the so-called House of Commons in 1912 with very bad grace, and quickly poisoned by the idea that this country could be sundered into two by the crime of partition, another source of perennial unrest in our country. The idea that this sort of glorified local government will suffice for national self-determination is of course utter nonsense. However, it was a step forward on the situation of the 1840s and 50s, where the famine genocide of An Gorta Mór wiped out at least 1.2 million people and decimated half of the remaining population who survived, driving them into industrial cities of England, Scotland and Wales, across the Atlantic predominantly to Canada and the United States of America, to Australasia and ultimately to Argentina, South Africa and other exotic locations. Now, even a Home Rule so-called Parliament in Dublin probably would not have visited that catastrophe upon us. But in 1912, there was no great cause for celebration. Home Rule would have been a mild amelioration on how Dublin Castle managed this country, one way or another. We would have had no control of foreign policy. We would have become a more efficient engine of their imperialism. We would remain globally heading towards this absolute zenith prior to the First World War, which knocked them down several pegs. Ireland would not have been a friendly place for those who were patriotic, those who were progressive, those who believed in suffrage, universal suffrage, those who believed in an appropriate national education, those who wished to retain some vestige of our Gaelic heritage, those who possessed it, which would have been something like 80% of the population. All of these things would not have been addressed by Home Rule. It is possible that they may have worked on those projects had things gone according to plan. But of course we know this, the British Conservative Party in opposition fostered, as before, the scurrilous and disgraceful and appalling spectre of sectarianism by allowing the UVF to come into existence, to foster them, to arm them against the wishes of their own House of Commons and House of Lords. It beggars belief. It is truly extraordinary. But that is the level to which the Empire Loyalists were prepared to go to prevent Ireland even having basically glorified local governance. Now, I ask you, I put it to you, people who say no, we want, and we can see this in the Proclamation of 1916, one of the most important political and progressive texts of its entire era. They wanted equality, they wanted a non-sectarian basis for the state, they were respectful of organised religion, but there'd be a separation of church and state. They wanted universal suffrage. It was the first international document ever addressed to Irish men and Irish women, or any man and any woman. A phrase, by the way, used years earlier by Patrick Pearse when raising money for the Volunteers and Scalena in the United States of America. They wanted, basically speaking, a democratic, republican, independent, sovereign nation. Now, anything short of that, to my mind, personally, and I can only speak personally as an Irish citizen, is unsatisfactory. And it's not just that it isn't wishful thinking. This is a country that knows the consequences of not having these things. We suffered more than most. Now, there are those who like to snide and quip that Irish people is complaining about how they are being treated. Many other people have suffered grievously under many imperialist dispensations. But we're up there with them. It's not a bloody competition. No one wants to be the most afflicted people on the planet. We're not, and God willing we never will be. But we have had a very bad experience of colonialism. No justification, to my mind, allows those who did not regard the rebels as being justified to paint them into a corner as some sort of sectarian fanatic extremists. No, that's what the House of Lords is. They're the sectarian fanatic extremists, not the people who fought in 1916. Now, I'm not going to give you a full historical lecture. It's not the time or place for it. I'm sure many want to reflect on the very significant legal decision that we only just heard about. But I will say a few things. This is clearly, and I'm glad to say this, again as an Irishman, a diverse, broad-based community and national project. This is not simply a one-faceted, single-dimensional, special interest affair. And that augurs well, I think, for the future, in many respects. 1916 was very much like that. Because once you had the foundation of Óg na hÉireann in the Rotunda, just around the corner from here, shortly afterwards, the foundation of Cumann na mBan as the female auxiliary, which itself was unusual. Then you had the alliance with the Irish Citizen Army, which was cemented in the early part of 1916, with the co-option, the very willing co-option ultimately, of James Connolly to the Military Council of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. You have effectively a broad political front of advanced Republican Socialists and indeed advanced Nationalists. There are people who come into their sort of milieu through the gateway of things like the GAA. So the GAA is never mentioned in terms of 1916, but many of those who took part in it would have cut their teeth with a stick in the hand rather than a rifle. As many of you I'm sure know, the GAA was founded by the Irish Republican Brotherhood to cultivate a sense of Irishness, an appropriate Irish self-belief and reliance and structure and linkages across this land, all 32 counties, in a way that was separate from the hostile Anglo-centric state imposed upon us. The Gaelic League was ostensibly concerned with the Irish language, but many of the key figures, not even Pearse himself, always pointed out that the language was central to his view of what Irish identity would be, and that's certainly a tenable position. It's a matter of debate, but it was always more than that. It was not just, as he said, philology. There's more to learning about Irish politics, Irish interests, Irish cultural speciality. Because whilst we share a great deal in common with our nearest neighbour, the English and Scottish Wales, we really do, particularly genetically the Scots, and after the so-called famine of Gortha Moor, we have a very sizable permanently emigrate population in the cities of England. We are different. We had a different trajectory, which they interrupted as long back as the 12th century. But we'll leave that for another day, right? Yeah. Suffice it to say, if I could sort of make the point very, very simply, 1916 offered the route to a better form of Ireland, which many who were interested in Irish, in Gaelic football, in Irish history, antiquarianism, in writing Irish plays in the Hibernian English vernacular, in writing plays in the Gaelic Irish vernacular, as Patrick Pearse did. All of these things have a commonality, which is the greatest interest of the greatest number of our people. And that can never be a bad thing. That must always be an idealised future for all of us. And you see it in the text of the 68th Proclamation. Now, I'm going to finish in a few minutes, but before I do that, I'll ask you to constructively reflect on a few minor points. Who fought in 1916? Well, in actuality, people who belong to all of those organisations and more. It was meant to have been, as we know, a truly national uprising by the Irish Volunteers, aka Óg na hÉireann, and known in 1916 as the IRA. Some of the history books that I was obliged to read when I was in college in the 1980s, the dark 1980s, would have you believe that the IRA came into existence as a concept in 1917. That is not true. If you read what people like the problematic, but none that's interesting, Brennan Whitmore wrote, if you read things like Dermot Lynch, the most significant, arguable significant conspirator, or whatever you want to call it, revolutionary, not to be executed in 1916, even though he sentenced to death, Dermot Lynch referred to the activities of the IRA in Dublin in 1916. Now, again, I don't want to bamboozle you with definitions and arcane history, but think of this term. The IRA was a phrase used by the Fenians when at war. They'd use it in 1866 when they invaded Canada from several locations in upstate and far western New York. Right? They had buttons that said IRA, they carried flags that said IRA. Because that's what Fenianism is. That got slightly modified in Dublin due to the alliance with the Irish Citizen Army, the Revolutionary Socialists, the armed workers. And when James Connolly, Commander-in-Chief in Dublin, addressed those of whom he had control, at least nominally, and fair dues to Connolly, actually, he referred to them as the Army of the Republic. So the Army of the Republic is basically speaking the IRA plus the Irish Citizen Army. And by 1917 and 1918, the ICA don't disappear, they basically morph into the IRA as well. That's where they tend to go. Now, that's a complicated discussion, there's more to it than that. Around them, you've come them on. It was remarkable that at least 70, and probably well more than that, female auxiliaries of the Irish Volunteer Movement took part in the rising. Now, it is more than that. There's a famous photograph that shows more than 6 of them gathered as veterans. And you weren't going to front up and be photographed in that context unless you'd actually done something. Right? There's no process of applying to a civil service authority 30, 40 years later. This is a reunion of women who fought. Some of them literally had combat roles, which was almost unheard of. Others had unarmed roles in combat, if I could put it that way. Running messages in any urban conflict or the rural conflict is exceptionally dangerous. In one case, fatal vis-a-vis coming them on. But always a dangerous episode. They engaged in the transport of weapons, the communication of intelligence, the gathering of intelligence, and indeed themselves and the Fianna Éireann played a very significant role in keeping the sinews of the garrison, the Irish Republican garrison, if you want to put it that way, well oiled. You also have, as I said there, the ICA themselves. They were not affected by the split, which MacNeill more or less outmanoeuvred in his best move ever, when the Redmondites destroyed the national base of the Irish Volunteers, but leaving a hardcore element behind that was more suitable for a revolutionary purpose. MacNeill's second act, of course, was to balk at the idea of rising without 30,000 German arms, which had been intercepted in Kerry in April, just before around Good Friday. The loss of Casement wasn't so significant, but the loss of the arms certainly was. Despite that, in much reduced circumstances, using the weapon that they received from IRB networks in Scotland, and the Glasgow-Derry route was very important, the Liverpool-Dublin route was important, and all the ports of North America to Dublin and other Irish ports were significant. Cork also. This is something the British were looking at in terms of reducing, but that's a different story. So you have the Irish Volunteers, who are basically speaking the armed element of the IRB. The IRB colonel within them, they controlled both the senior positions. You have the Irish Citizen Army, who got co-opted doing much more fighting than originally planned by occupying St Stephen's Green, briefly and disastrously, and then far more successfully in College of Surgeons. That's adaptability. Of raiding Harker Street, raiding the Shelburne Hotel, of fighting with the headquarters element having marched down from Liberty Hall, of crossing the Liffey and investing City Hall when Dublin Castle cross proved an impossible task to achieve. losing Sean Connolly in the process. You have Cumann na mBan everywhere. You have Na Fianna Éireann everywhere. And it's in these very buildings, of course, that due to Connolly's incapacitation by several wounds, McLaughlin took over, a young man who cut his teeth in Na Fianna Éireann. So where did they see themselves? They saw themselves as being the revolutionary vanguard on behalf of an Irish people to whom they could not address. Notwithstanding the massive proliferation of newspapers in 1912, 13, 14, 15, and they're very much in vogue at the moment, and I'm glad to see it. It's not a bad thing that certain elements are cashing in on all of this. It's not a bad thing if the general level of education and knowledge and access to sources is increased throughout society. Right? I can live with it. Right? They saw themselves as being the Irish human being. In hindsight, it became quite obvious where this impetus had come from. Once the British had declared war on Germany in August 1914, the Clan na Gael networks in America were anxious, not just willing, but anxious to prevent an Irish uprising. Had there been more time, the vast sums of money raised in the United States would have led to the massive consignment of weaponry in the United States and their transshipment to Ireland. And it was because that became impossible due to the US neutrality policy and the manner in which the First War, Battle of the Atlantic, was being covered, I suppose, that made the reliance on token aid from Germany more significant. That aid was negotiated not in Dublin, but in New York City and Washington DC, and possibly the Consulate in San Francisco as well, and probably other places we've never heard of and may never even ever hear of due to the secrecy of such matters. That involved sending Thomas Ashe, Dermot Lynch, Roger Casement via Glasgow, Montreal. Plunkett himself went on a highly dangerous mission to the United States to fine-tune some things. Others as well. It's quite an interesting story. And they knew then, the Military Council of Ireland knew then, and were actively planning from the earliest part of 1915, there was going to be a rising. Now, some of their conditions for rising are interesting. And again, I'm going to finish in a few minutes, but I'll just raise these with you, because they're worth bearing in mind. One was if the government implemented the Defence of the Realm Act to suppress the National Volunteers, the Irish Volunteers per se, right? In other words, whilst there was a Forge Castle document stating there's an imminent crackdown, and that was a forgery, it was actually a genuine plan of the authorities anyway. It was simply postponed from Easter till after Easter because they believed that the loss of the odd of Kerry was enough to neuter the strategy. The actions of Casement in captivity, well-intentioned but wrong. The actions of MacNeill, well-intentioned also, but from my perspective, in hindsight, from the benefit and privilege of being born decades after him, a pity. It meant that the national uprising was going to be a lot more contained. Hence the exaggerated focus on Dublin City. Dublin's only meant to be the first element of coup d'etat backed by rural uprisings and blocking actions elsewhere around the 32 counties. But they went for it. And when they did with far more success than they had expected. The men who turned out were asked to fight, that is, the men who came out to fight, and those who were around them, were, depending on the garrison they're in, were asked to bring 2 to 3 days worth of rations, which gives you some idea of what they expected in terms of, well, what could we manage under these circumstances. Because by then they knew it would be just them and a few other columns in and around the country. There was more activity in Wexford, in Galway, men from Kildare came into the city, there were actions in Derry and Donegal, there was a decent mobilisation of County Antrim men in East Tyrone. The Tyrone men themselves were out in various parts of that county also. There was a fair bit more activity. Both the Cork and the Limerick volunteers did take the field, despite MacNeill, but due to the massive proliferation of conflicting orders, they didn't fight in the end. So we have a narrative that is very Dublin-centric. But having said that, if you don't strike with effect in the national capital, you will never win a revolution. Not when your enemy is headquartered in and around you, right? This is a very heavily garrisoned city. Look at all the barracks in this place now. Most have been decommissioned. Until relatively recently, Collins Barracks was the largest occupied inner city barracks in the Western world, right? And then you've got Island Bridge, you've got Portobello, you've got McKee Barracks. Dublin was a military industrial complex. It's quite extraordinary. So when they struck, they did so to make certain of one thing, that the voice of the ideal of the sovereign Irish Republic would be heard, as encapsulated in the brilliant text of the 1916 proclamation. And that's why they put such pains into broadcasting its text repeatedly out to whoever would pick up such signals in a time when wireless technology was limited. But it was a genuine international broadcast. The aim was obviously to get foreign governments, namely the Americans, possibly the French, who became very sympathetic afterwards, possibly even Berlin, to ratify the 1916 proclamation. And that would have changed everything. They survived 2 days. They survived 3 days. On the third and fourth days, the entire city centre around here was being peppered by heavy artillery. They brought 18-pounder guns into use in Dublin City. This is something very, very strange, even by the standards of the First World War, to fire that level of ordnance into civilian occupied areas that had not been evacuated, that is not formally evacuated. The much vaunted RIC and DNP had largely fled the scene, apart from those who sneaked around to spy on those who took part in the rising. Many of those who were taken prisoner were fortunate not to be summarily executed by the rebels. Had they been captured on the Western Front by the British, they would have been hanged as spies. But anyway, I digress. 1916, clearly, obviously, as we all know here, clearly, I can say that much I hope, was a pivotal event in Irish history. It deserves to be regarded as that by us. It's a shame we don't have a Republic Day yet. It's a shame the 24th of April is not an annual political holiday in a country that has no constitutional holiday. None. Right? That is a problem. That is something that can be worked upon. But until we begin to, I think, to seriously deal with our actual political legacies, we've no hope for getting ourselves out of the social, political, cultural morass we find ourselves in right now. This particular issue is in many ways a microcosm of the greater malaise in Irish society. Why would people from various backgrounds, as in 1916, have to come into any set of buildings to say something that would be a much prized and internationally vaunted symbol of state in any other country? Why can't we have a Bastille Day? Why can't we have a 4th of July? We can, we should, we must, and one day we will. So on a personal note, as an Irish citizen, I thank you for all your endeavour. I think we'll see.